Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program at Yale. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's event, this lecture on police reform with Rafael Mangual. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program and then introduce our guest. The William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We've hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference each year since 2011. Our over 500 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new ideas, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyprogram.com. Now for our guest. Rafael Mangual is the Nick O'Neill Fellow and Head of Research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. He has authored and co-authored several Manhattan Institute reports and op-eds on issues ranging from urban crime and jail violence and criminal and civil justice reform. His work has been featured and mentioned in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, and City Journal. He is also the author of Criminal Injustice, which offers a more balanced understanding of American criminal justice and cautions against discarding traditional crime control measures. Now for Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you for that really kind introduction. I always hate hearing my own introductions. It's just strange to hear this litany of things. I promise that I'm not anywhere close to as important as that makes me sound. So again, I just want to start by thanking you, Ryan, for the nice introduction, also to the Buckley program for the invitation to speak here tonight. This event was originally supposed to be a debate, but due to forces beyond his control, my opponent was unable to make it. As such, you will all be stuck with me this evening. So I was asked to address the topic of police reform, which is something of an amorphous term. I think it's fair to say, however, that generally speaking, the term police reform is mostly used to refer to policy changes that are aimed primarily at constraining or restricting the police powers, the powers that they can exercise, as well as the things that police officers are allowed to do when they're out in the field. I think it's also fair to say that these policy changes are usually offered up as ways to reduce the sort of incidents that really drive the police reform debate in the United States. That is, uses of force. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this topic is a heavy one. It's incredibly complex, and particularly in the sort of post-Ferguson, post-Floyd era that we live in and currently inhabit, it can also be very emotionally charged and politically fraught. That said, the stakes of our ongoing national police reform debate are quite high, in some cases even rising to the level of life and death. So I will aim, as I think we all should, to approach these questions that have arisen in this ongoing debate with humility and sobriety. Now, this debate is one that implicates really important claims regarding racial justice as well as of public safety. And at a time in which more than 24 major cities in the United States have seen record homicide tallies over the last few years, and in which major city police departments continue to struggle mightily with officer recruitment and retention, it is critical that when we tread in this particular policy space, we do so carefully. Now, in the time allotted for my remarks today, I couldn't possibly cover everything that might fall under the umbrella of police reform, so what I'm going to do is speak to what I believe are the practical limits of 4 broad reform proposals that have gotten a lot of recent attention. And I'm going to do that from the perspective of somebody who is generally, though not always, skeptical of proposals that would either raise the transaction costs of enforcing the law or lower the transaction costs of breaking the law. Now, when I refer to the limits of a particular reform proposal, what I'm referring to is the likelihood that said proposal will, if enacted, 1, significantly reduce police uses of force, and 2, do so without significantly harming the public safety. The reasons for this are that A, police uses of force really constitute the very reasons that we're all here, the reasons that we're having this conversation. As such, I think it's fair to evaluate reform proposals on their potential to make force less likely. And B, the biggest potential cost of tinkering with policing policy is that of crime going up, which is not trivial. particularly if you are among those without the good fortune of living in one of our country's many incredibly safe enclaves. And I'm going to take a quick detour here. It's very common for us, and I'm guilty of this too in some ways, to discuss crime in national terms, in statewide terms, in citywide terms. But the reality is that crime, the vast majority of crime, is very hyper-concentrated. It's hyper-concentrated geographically, and it's hyper-concentrated demographically. Every year in the United States, somewhere in the range of 2% of US counties see 50% of US murders, whereas about 60% of US counties see precisely 0 murders in a given year. American homicides and violent crimes more generally tend to cluster in very, very small pockets of our nation's cities and suburbs. And to give you an idea of what this looks like, I want to point you to the work of a criminologist named David Weisberg, who developed what he called the rule of crime concentration, which basically posits that somewhere in the range of 5% of a city's street segments, and if you don't know what a street segment is, picture a city block. It's both sidewalks corner to corner. 5% of city street segments will see approximately 50% of that city's crime. And an even smaller share will see 50% of the city's violent crime. Now, in my home city of New York, 3.5% of our 82,000 street segments see 50% of all violent crime every single year, and just over 1% of our street segments see 25% of our city's violence. Now, demographically, violent crimes, homicides and shootings in particular, are hyper-concentrated among young, Black, and Latino males. Again, using my home city of New York as an example, last year, 97% of our city's nearly 2,000 shooting victims were either Black or Hispanic. Almost all of them were males. Now, I can assure you that Black and Hispanic males don't constitute anywhere close to 97% of New York City's population. And for every single year that we have public data going back to 2008, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims are either Black or Hispanic in New York. Now, the reason I wanted to take a quick detour to emphasize this point is that concerns about racial equity often feature prominently in discussions about police reform, mainly because Black and Latino males are overrepresented given their share of the general population, which is an important caveat, among those who are subjected to force by the police. And so reducing the rate at which police officers use force is often presented as a means of addressing an important racial disparity. But what often gets forgotten is that the downside risk of shrinking the footprint of police or reimagining public safety, or however you want to formulate it, that's going to fall disproportionately on the shoulders of those very same communities. Okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. Now let's get to some of the reform proposals that I wanted to touch on tonight. So I'm going to discuss defunding the police, demilitarizing the police, abolishing qualified immunity, and diverting more calls to mental health responders. So all of these proposals, which are very popular and often floated by policy officials across the country at all levels of government, including Congress and the state legislatures and city councils, they all suffer from at least one of two practical limits in their ability to significantly reduce police uses of force, particularly deadly force, which is really kind of the main driver of this debate, without harming public safety. And the first of these limits lies in the data on police use of force, which establishes that force is already quite rare in terms of likely outcomes of police-citizen encounters, such that there is much less room for improvement than one might guess if they were just consuming the mainstream media narrative about policing in the US. The second of the practical limits lies in the relevant empirical literature about these reform proposals, which in many cases will suggest that these proposals will be either ineffective or dangerously counterproductive. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of these proposals that I just mentioned, I think it's important to say a few words about the first of these two practical limits that I just outlined. Now, this may come as a shock to some of you, but despite the proliferation of viral videos online and the rhetorical posture of the reform debate, police uses of force in the US are very, very rare. Now, let's start with deadly force. Between 2015 and 2020, police in the United States shot and killed an average of 993 people a year. Now, the police have killed almost 6,000 people a year in the last, or 7,000 people a year in the last 7 years is undoubtedly concerning, but context is important. And viewing the number of fatal police encounters in its proper context undercuts the claim, central to the case for the reforms that I'm going to discuss later, that America has a police violence problem. Now, this is not to say that police never use excessive force, nor is it to assert that there's no room for improvement in police training and tactics that might, at the margins, reduce incidents of force. But context is really, really important, because to the extent that the police violence problem is overstated, so too will the potential impact of any policy levers pulled to address that problem be overstated, which matters because the advisability of a particular policy shift depends in part on how much will change and in what direction should that policy be adopted. So let's contextualize things. Again, there is no question that every single year there are many documented cases of excessive police uses of force which are individually problematic. One is too many. However, to establish that there exists a national police violence problem, I think one has to demonstrate that such individual incidents are representative of a larger pattern. And the data on police shootings and uses of force more generally simply don't support that conclusion. Now, using data from 2018, I estimated in a recent paper on both fatal and non-fatal police shootings that police in the US purposefully discharged their firearms a total of 3,043 times, which includes discharges in which no one was hit. Now, that probably sounds like a lot. It's about 8 shootings a day. But that number needs to be contextualized in light of the overall volume of police activity. Now, that same year, 2018, we had more than 686,000 full-time police officers, not including part-time officers or volunteer officers, who made more than 10.3 million arrests and had more than 75 million public contacts with some 53 million people over the age of 16. Now, this is the data that I think should frame our analysis. If we were to attribute each of those 3,043 estimated firearms discharges by police in 2018 to a unique officer, we'd be able to infer that at most, 0.4% of cops purposefully discharged their firearms that year. If we assume that every one of those shootings happened during the course of an arrest, it would mean that at most 0.03% of arrests involved the use of deadly force by police. Now, given the fact that the vast majority of those shot by police are both armed and actively resisting, disaggregating justifiable uses of deadly force would actually show that unjustifiable force is even rarer than the numbers I just gave you. Nor does the case for police violence get stronger when considering the data on non-deadly force. According to a Bureau of Justice Statistics study covering a 10-year period, 2002 to 2011, just 0.8% of people who had contact with the police reported being subjected to physical force. 0.8%. In 2018, a research team of doctors and criminologists conducted a study of police uses of force that was published in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. That research team analyzed over 1 million calls for service across 3 mid-sized police departments in North Carolina, Louisiana, and Arizona over a 2-year period. Now, those calls for service resulted in 114,000 criminal arrests. Physical force was used in just 1 out of every 128 of them, meaning that more than 99% of the arrests were effected without the use of any physical force whatsoever. Now, the medical researchers on that team went on to look at the medical records of all of those who were arrested at intake, where their injuries are surveyed by doctors at the jail or people who went to the hospital. What they found was that 98% of those against whom force was used sustained, quote, no or mild injury. Just 1.8% of the suspects against whom force was used sustained moderate or severe injuries. And in that entire data set, there was just 1 fatal police shooting captured. Across 3 police departments, 1 million calls for service, 2 years. So, in the context of almost 700,000 officers making more than 10 million arrests a year, conducting millions of traffic stops and pedestrian stops, and engaging with the public in all sorts of other encounters, I submit that the existence of a police violence problem at a national level cannot be established. The more important takeaway for the purposes of this talk, however, is that police are already able to effect arrests without the use of force nearly 100% of the time, which means that they're getting it right the vast majority of the time. Now, unless perfection is the standard, there's probably not a whole lot that can be done through policy that would have more than a marginal impact on police use of force. Now, this doesn't mean that reform is not worth pursuing, but it does mean that we ought to be sober and realistic about just how much we should expect things to improve. Now, there is one reform proposal that would significantly reduce police uses of force, and that's defunding the police. The problem is, though, that the criminological literature makes overwhelmingly clear that pulling this particular policy lever will result in the deaths of a hell of a lot more people than police kill. There's a robust body of research which includes both natural experiments and randomized control trials that suggest that police can and will have significant crime reduction effects if we invest in them. Economists Jonathan Click and Alexander Tabarrok found a strong causal connection between police presence and crime. They looked at variances in police presence along the National Mall in Washington, D.C. that were a function of changes in the post-9/11 terror threat level, which gave us a nice little natural experiment. And they looked at how crime along the National Mall and around the National Mall changed as a result. And holding everything else constant, what they found was that crime declined sharply when the police presence was boosted as a result of a change in the alert level. In another study, Click, along with criminologist John McDonald and a law professor named Ben Grunwald, found that an increase in police patrols outside the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, quote, decreased crime in adjacent city blocks by between 43 and 73%. A study conducted by University of Pennsylvania criminologist Aaron Chalfin, along with Justin McCrary, found, quote, reduced victim costs of $1.63 for each additional dollar spent on policing in 2010, implying that U.S. cities are under-policed. Very few public expenditures on a scale, in terms of scalable interventions can produce that kind of return on investment. And then, of course, beyond the multiple studies showing that police have a crime reduction effect, there are also studies showing that reducing police activity leads to more crime. And one example of this is a 2020 paper by Harvard economists Tanaya Devi and Roland Fryer, which found that pattern and practice investigations launched in the wake of a viral incident by the Department of Justice resulted in almost 1,000 additional homicides and 34,000 additional felonies over just 2 years in just 5 American cities. And that crime spike was, they found, driven by decreases in police proactivity, things like traffic stops, pedestrian stops. Now, why might a decrease in traffic stops result in an increase in homicides? Well, in the New York City Police Department, more than 42% of all gun recoveries begin as a traffic encounter. Now, for an illustrative example of what significantly hamstringing the police might mean for vulnerable communities, consider that between May 29th and May 31st of 2020, while police in the city of Chicago were occupied with quelling violent protests in the city's downtown after the murder of George Floyd, Chicago saw its most violent weekend of that year with 84 people shot and 23 people murdered. That Sunday was the city's most violent day since 1961, when it began keeping track of daily homicides. Now, betting that this was mere coincidence, I think, A, strains credulity, and 2, runs counter to the body of evidence supporting the proposition that when police activity is curtailed, crime goes up. But as you should remember from an earlier part of my talk, it will go up for some much more than others. Now, having said all that, I want to reiterate that I know police are not perfect. Even their staunchest defenders have to acknowledge that some officers have indeed taken one too many sips from the fountain of power that is a government-issued badge and gun. This is a problem. The question is what to do about it. Defunding them clearly is not the answer, so let's look at 3 other popular reform proposals. How about demilitarizing the police? Here again, there are a lot of data points which cast doubt on the validity of the hypothesis that the militarization of police from about 1970 forward has contributed to unjustified uses of force. Now, in making this case, critics often point to upticks in the use of SWAT teams by police departments around the country and call for the curtailment of SWAT operations. Now, it's true that these units are more common and have been deployed with more and more frequency, mostly for warrant service operations over the last 40 years. But the data do not support the idea that SWAT teams are driving use of force numbers. A 2008 study prepared for the DOJ's Institute of Justice estimated that SWAT officers fired their weapons in just 342 of well over 10,000 SWAT operations that were evaluated. 342 out of 10,000. In New York City, again, my hometown, emergency service unit officers, which is our SWAT team, they did not record a single shooting in all of 2019. In 2018, they recorded just 1 shooting. By contrast, non-ESU officers recorded 57 shootings over that 2-year period. In Chicago, for 2017 to 2018, SWAT officers filed just 26 of the more than 10,000 tactical response reports, which are filed whenever officers use physical force in the field during that period. Even the ACLU, in a 2014 study on police militarization, found that just 5 of the 818 SWAT raids that they evaluated resulted in a fatal police shooting. Mind you that there's some selection bias at play here, because they're picking a incredibly volatile encounter that is much more likely to result in a shooting than the typical encounter. So the fact that there were only 5 really speaks volumes. Another problem with this critique is that the case that the post-Vietnam militarization of police departments contributed to police violence, it just doesn't square with the trend of police uses of force since the 1970s. In 1971, NYPD officers shot 221 people. They killed almost 100. In 1972, they shot 145 people. By 1990, that number was down to 72, and in 2016, it was just 23, which is about where it's leveled off ever since. In Chicago, police shot about 130 people per year between 1974 and 1978. In 2018, the CPD reported just 43 firearm discharges. Another reason to be skeptical of the claim that police violence in the U.S. is a function of militarization is that the rate of force complaints in this country is basically mirrored by those in England and Wales. Now, why does this matter? Well, given that most police officers in the UK patrol without a firearm, it would be difficult to claim that police there are as militarized as they are here. Yet, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, quote, the overall rates of complaint per 100 officers in both countries are similar, 7.5 force complaints per 100 officers in U.S. large local agencies versus 7.2 oppressive behavior complaints per 100 officers in England and Wales. Another militarization-related proposal is to eliminate what's known as the 1033 program. How many of you people have heard of this? It's a program through which the U.S. Department of Defense provides military surplus equipment to local and state police agencies. Things like rifles, body armor, armored personnel carriers. Now, this program's actually been the subject of close empirical examination over the last few years, and the results are really mixed. There are 3 separate econometric analyses that in recent years could not find a statistically significant association between 1033 program acquisitions and uses of force or police or suspect injuries. One of those studies did find that 1033 acquisitions actually showed to be a cost-effective crime reduction tool through the mechanism of deterrence, which makes sense. After all, if you look out your window and see a SWAT team versus 2 police officers in plain clothes, you're probably going to be a lot less likely to fight. There have been other analyses that have found that the 1033 program acquisitions seem to have increased the rate at which police use force, but the overall effect sizes are not particularly large. So the most I think we can say about this literature is that it doesn't seem very likely that scrapping the 1033 program will do very much good or very much harm. Maybe it's worth doing, maybe it's not, but it is not likely to reduce police uses of force by any significant level. So let's move on to another reform proposal, the abolition of qualified immunity. This has gotten a lot of attention in the news and in Congress. In essence, qualified immunity, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a legal defense that's meant to be a protection against ex post facto liability for conduct that is ruled to be a civil rights violation after the conduct is engaged in as a result of a new development in the law that recognizes a right for the first time. Qualified immunity abolitionists posit that the defense essentially functions as an unpierceable shield against liability for cops, such that officers then internalize a sense of impunity that they carry with them into the field and then misbehave in ways that they wouldn't if they had more financial skin in the game. Now, this makes sense intuitively to a lot of people. As such, the abolition of qualified immunity is often held up as a way to significantly reduce excessive uses of force. Now, while this narrative has succeeded in influencing both public opinion and various reform efforts, it is wrong for at least 3 reasons. First, this narrative assumes without any evidence that officers regularly and accurately assess their likelihood of successfully mounting a qualified immunity defense in light of the binding precedents in their respective jurisdictions when deciding whether, and if so, how, to use force in the field. Now, that sounds a little ridiculous because it is. Most police officers don't have any formal legal training. But more than that, there's a sizable body of research that has shown that in the context of situations involving the use of force, police officers overwhelmingly tend toward intuitive decision-making processes, which, according to a 2018 paper on the subject, quote, involves recognizing and identifying cues and then matching them to patterns organized in the individual's long-term memory. The study found, quote, no evidence of recruits using a purely analytical approach to their force decisions. Now, the main reason for this tendency toward an intuitive approach to use of force decisions is that these encounters in which these decisions are generally made tend to be very rapidly unfolding and very volatile situations that simply don't lend themselves to the type of analysis that would go into an officer assessing his or her risk of personal liability based on the type and level of force used in that situation. I mean, just think about it. If you are a law student taking a final exam and you're presented with a fact pattern and you have a bunch of knowledge that you've consumed over the course of a semester, it's still going to take you about half an hour to answer that question correctly on a final exam about whether or not there's qualified immunity here that would be successful as a defense. The idea that police officers are doing this in split-second decision-making context is just silly. So that's reason one. Reason two is that the standard story about qualified immunity just doesn't hold water in light of the fact that there's available data that undermines the claim that the defense accounts for a significant share of police litigation outcomes. For example, the Legal Aid Society maintains a database of lawsuits, 2,387 of them, filed against the New York City Police Department in federal court between January 2015 and June 2018. Now, if you filter out those cases by disposition, just 74 cases were resolved in favor of the police defendants. Now, even if all 74 of those cases were disposed of on qualified immunity grounds, we're still only talking about 3% of the cases in that database. I'd also like to point you all to an empirical assessment of qualified immunity that was published in a 2017 issue of the Yale Law Journal, done by UCLA professor and noted qualified immunity abolitionist, mind you, Joanna Schwartz, in which she makes a case for abolition by illustrating that qualified immunity, quote, rarely serves its intended role as a shield. Her study found that less than 4% of more than 1,100 cases analyzed resulted in whole or partial grants of dismissal or summary judgment on qualified immunity grounds. Now, as Professor Schwartz noted in the Wall Street Journal about 2 years ago, unsuccessful cases against police tend to fail because of other procedural and substantive infirmities as opposed to because of qualified immunity. In that very same letter to the editor, Professor Schwartz went on to note that abolishing qualified immunity, quote, won't flood the courts with frivolous lawsuits, which undermines any suggestion that the explanation for why qualified immunity doesn't account for a particularly large share of police litigation outcomes owes to some large number of cases not getting filed in anticipation of being disposed of on qualified immunity grounds, which, by the way, is something else that Joanna Schwartz has studied. She actually surveyed the lawyers that litigated the cases in that first study to ask them if they regularly filter out cases based on the risk that they might get disposed of on qualified immunity grounds, and a very, very small minority said yes. Almost no one said that they do that on a regular basis. Why? Because for the most part, this kind of litigation practice is a volume business. You know some cases are going to fail. You know some are going to succeed. It doesn't really pay not to file them. So the third major flaw in the dominant narrative about qualified immunity is that abolishing the defense won't actually result in police officers having more financial skin in the game because it's not actually the source of financial protection for police officers. That's because when police officers are held individually liable when they're sued, their employers indemnify them against liability. That is, they pick up the tab pursuant to either contractual or statutory obligations to do so. It's worth noting, and going back to the work of Professor Schwartz here, because she empirically assessed the role of indemnification in police litigation in 2014 and found that, quote, governments paid approximately 99.98% of all the dollars that plaintiffs recovered in lawsuits alleging civil rights violations by law enforcement. So there's simply nothing in the available data that suggests that abolishing qualified immunity would do anything to change this very standard, indeed nearly universal practice that would require significant statutory reform, none of which is being proposed alongside qualified immunity abolition. Finally, there is the proposal to take police out of the mental health response game. Now here, there's actually some evidence to suggest that we should continue to invest in efforts to augment the police by deploying civilian crisis intervention teams to calls that involve people in crisis. In a report released earlier this year, my Manhattan Institute colleague and Yale alum, Charles Fane Lehman, reviewed some of that evidence. And among the approaches that he evaluated in that report is a popular and very oft-cited and promising effort launched in Eugene, Oregon called CAHOOTS, which stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. Now, while effective, CAHOOTS is also a case study in the limits of programs that are loosely referred to as police alternatives. As Lehman notes in his report, quote, CAHOOTS responders are highly specialized. In 2019, they covered just 17% of Eugene's 911 calls, with 75% of those calls being for a welfare check, providing transportation to someone who's usually homeless or in need, or assisting the police that are already on the scene. Even in those relatively limited circumstances, cahoots responders are still calling for backup in roughly 1 in every 67 calls for service in 2019. So it's really hard to see that model scaling up to cover the other 83% of 911 calls to the Eugene Police Department. And doing so would involve not just dramatically scaling up cahoots' $2.1 million budget, but also identifying a large population of trained crisis intervention professionals, and most significantly, getting those professionals to agree to handle situations that grow increasingly risky as their responsibilities expand. And to do that at all hours of the night, because the vast majority of these calls are coming in on the weekend at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and most people with PhDs in psychology choose to take cushier jobs than responding to a guy covered in his own urine who's screaming in the middle of Grand Central Station at night. Now, as a complement to policing, I think cahoots is a useful model for other cities to adopt. Again, it's not an either or. But when you consider the sheer volume of mental health calls received by police, not to mention, again, the fact that they're often received in the late of night or early morning hours, it becomes very clear that we simply do not have the capacity to shift this responsibility in total. Another complicating factor is that it's often unclear as to whether a 911 call can be accurately categorized as one that can be safely diverted away from police to civilian responders trained in mental health crises, as opposed to the police based on the 911 dispatcher's information. One study of such calls for service in the city of Philadelphia recently found, quote, that some medical or public health activity initially masquerades as crime or other policing work, and some events eventually determined to be police/crime activity can initially appear to be public health related. The study went on to note that, quote, about 20% of the activity in this area does not appear predictable from the initial call type as handled by police dispatch. So there's just another practical challenge to this. When dispatchers get a 911 call, they're usually not getting anywhere near enough information to say with 100% certainty that there's no danger here so that we can take the police off this one and give this to an unarmed civilian responder. So, all right, I've covered a lot, and I want to make sure I leave time for Q&A. So I'll close with this. I think one of the reasons that we see so much widespread anger and frustration expressed in the wake of viral incidents of police misconduct, such as in the murder of George Floyd, is that there's a belief that there are ready and obvious solutions to the problem of police abuse, and whatever its actual scope. And as understandable as the desire for clear answers to serious problems is, I think this belief is ultimately misplaced. So is the assertion that policing is a fundamentally rotten enterprise. There are things that we can do to make policing better, and I'd be happy to talk about that during Q&A. But the road to real reform begins not with a rush forward, but with a step back to consider the complicated realities that our passions may be obscuring. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I'll start with a question and then turn it over to the audience. So you've made a number of media appearances since the release of your book. I know recently, or maybe a few months ago, you were on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah.
Strange thing.
I'm just wondering, when you engage in these conversations and debates with people who disagree with you, what have you found to be like the most compelling argument or the most compelling point, or maybe like what they're the most surprised by, the most surprised to hear you say, or the thing they find themselves agreeing with you the most on that they didn't expect?
I think that the best way to connect with someone who disagrees with you is to try and have the argument on their terms as much as possible. And, you know, I guess you could say I'm on the right. I'm relatively conservative, somewhat libertarian on some things. So, you know, when I'm engaged with someone who is left of center, I think they tend to be really concerned about these equity arguments. And so there's a lot to say there, though. You know, if you accept their premises about what we should gather from racial disparities in data sets, that's one of the reasons why I lean into the disparities with respect to victimization, because there's not a really good argument for why we should pay less attention to those. And I find that when you are speaking about those disparities from the point of view of the victim, kind of using that same language allows you to connect and sort of get past that initial hurdle of potential hostility that might, you know, block a potentially fruitful exchange. And I think when I do that, sometimes when it succeeds, it sort of disarms that person, and you can have, you know, just a nicer, calmer, and deeper conversation. So that I think is probably the most helpful thing that I try to keep in mind, is just have the argument with them on their terms.
So you mentioned that there are some policy changes that should be made. Can you talk a little more about those?
Yeah. So one of the things that I started thinking about after the death of Breonna Taylor was the use of no-knock warrants. Now, there's a dispute as to whether or not a no-knock warrant was actually executed in her case. They had a no-knock warrant, but police officers claimed that they knocked and announced. But leaving that aside, I do think that this is a really potentially volatile way to service warrants. And so I wouldn't eliminate no-knock warrants altogether. I do think that they have some value in cases where police do need that element of surprise, but I do think that police departments are a little too freewheeling when it comes to pursuing no-knock warrants. And so what I would do is propose a reform that tasks a police executive in every single agency with evaluating no-knock warrant applications before they go to the judge for tactical necessity. And that evaluation has to be based on actual actionable intelligence, right? I mean, there's so many cases, and I write about one of them in the book, where police officers are executing warrants on houses that they didn't even surveil in the hour before they executed the warrant. They have no idea who's in the house, where in the house they might be. And one of the stories I tell about how this can go wrong is that of a young family who was sleeping in what looks from the outside to be a garage, but was just an extension of the house, with their infant who was in a playpen. Police officers threw a flashbang grenade through a window in the dark of night. The flashbang grenade landed in the playpen and nearly blew the kid's face off, and he's had countless reconstruction surgeries. Now, all this could have been avoided. Their target wasn't even home. They would have known that had they sat on the house, right? So that's one reform that I think is certainly worth pursuing. Another reform is on the qualified immunity front, right? I mean, I do think that there is some validity to the critique that, the way that our qualified immunity law is currently operated, you have this situation where police officers get to continuously benefit from the ambiguity in the law and the lack of development in the law. And so there's a case called Saucier that the Supreme Court decided a long time ago, and basically what it held was that the qualified immunity analysis was dual part, right? So first you have to decide, is there a violation of a civil right? And if there is, was that right clearly established at the time of the interaction such that the police can be fairly held liable? Now, after that case came down, courts thought that they had to address both questions. But then a few years later, the Supreme Court in a case called Pearson versus Callahan said that actually, in the interest of judicial economy, we will allow judges to dispose of qualified immunity cases simply if the right was not clearly established, i.e. without actually deciding whether or not the right was violated in the first place or if it even exists. And so what this has meant is that police are suffering in terms of reputational damage from the fact that a lot of qualified immunity grants are based on the clearly established prong, and people take that to assume that there's been a constitutional violation even though that question wasn't reached. But the critics of qualified immunity also have a bone to pick, because what that means is that as long as that constitutional question gets avoided, you have that ambiguity remain, and so police officers get to continuously benefit. And so one way to sort of more quickly shrink the scope of rights that are not clearly established and get the law and encourage the law to be developed to the point that qualified immunity becomes obsolete as a defense is to reinstate the Saucier sequence, which you can do statutorily. And so that's a reform that I've proposed. I think we would all be better off for better data and more stringent reporting requirements being imposed on police officers. I think an emphasis on college recruitment would be really good. There's a lot of research showing that police officers with college degrees will use force much less often than police officers without a college degree, even when you control for the circumstances, years of service, et cetera. There's mixed evidence as to the theories of why that is, but the evidence does seem pretty clear. And police departments, frankly, don't do a very good job of attracting college applicants, especially now as we continue to demonize the profession. I thought about becoming a cop when I was in college. I took the LSAT and the NYPD exam the same week, and my dad, who's a retired NYPD detective, threatened to never talk to me again if I became a cop. In his mind, he kind of already saw the writing on the wall, and he was like, you have options, exercise those options. And we need to do a better job of making that profession attractive to people with options, because those are people who are going to be more motivated, more careful. They're going to have higher IQs, more psychological stability. They'll be better at kind of weighing things in short periods of time and making better decisions. I'm trying to think of what else I would do. There's a big push to eliminate neck restraints. chokeholds, as they're called. They're not really chokeholds because you're not restricting the airway. No one's taught to restrict the airway. You're taught to restrict the flow of blood, which makes you pass out. And it's not particularly dangerous. There's a lot of research on this. Death is not a likely result. If any of you guys watch the UFC, people get choked out all the time. They wake up a few seconds later and ask where they are. But using these kinds of restraint techniques, not just neck restraints, but jiu-jitsu in general has actually been studied and shown to significantly reduce injuries to suspects and officers. If you teach officers how to effectively grapple when they're going hands-on with a suspect, and you give them the power to do that, you end up with situations in which uses of force are much more likely to end at the point of going hands-on and less likely to devolve to the point where more serious uses of force become necessary. And if you're in a jurisdiction like New York City, which has what's called the diaphragm law, which criminalizes even the accidental placement of pressure on the chest, back, or neck of a suspect during the course of an arrest, with no exception for a resisting suspect, police officers are going to become much more likely to resort to uses of force that don't require them to get close and go hands-on. So you're going to see an uptick in tasers, which can be more dangerous than neck restraints. You're going to see an uptick in strikes with wands or fists, kicks. So that's something that I think needs to be looked at more. Those are just a few that come to mind.
Thank you for coming. I actually was just talking to Mr. Lehman earlier today. He says hello. But apart from that, one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk was how you're Hispanic, and I'm also Hispanic. And one of the things that has really fascinated me with this debate is the way that the narrative has constantly been spun as though the tough on crime platform is one that alienates minorities and people of color. But in my experience, people of color tend to be the most tough on crime, at least when in conversation. They tend to be more often pro-death penalty, more often pro-broken windows policing. Like, why do you think the narrative has been cultivated in this way? Is there any way to combat it? Like, I really hate being tokenized and being given a position that I don't hold.
I hear where you're coming from, and you're exactly right. I mean, there's a lot of survey data out there that shows, exactly what you're saying, that, Black communities, Latino communities tend to have very favorable views toward the police. 81% of Black Americans told Gallup last year that they wanted as much or more policing than they were currently getting. Not what I think the researchers thought they were going to find when they administered that survey. You see lots of support for incarceration. There's actually a really great book called Black Silent Majority by a professor out at Claremont McKenna named Michael J. Fortner, and he documents the sort of history of the Rockefeller drug laws in New York State, which were our mandatory minimums for crack and powder cocaine, and shows the role that the Black community played in that legislation, which imposed what a lot of people would call today really draconian penalties for drug dealing. And he looks at editorials in Black newspapers in Harlem and the floor statements of Black leaders in Congress, and you would be surprised. I mean, you would think that you were sort of reading from the pages of National Review in 1960. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 is a really good example of this. This is the federal law signed by President Reagan that established the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. It's often viewed and presented today as obvious evidence of racist policymaking, because crack cocaine was much more likely to be consumed in Black neighborhoods versus powder cocaine, which was much more likely to be consumed in white neighborhoods. But you go into the legislative history, what you'll find is that 16 of the 19 members of the Congressional Black Caucus at the time co-sponsored, not just voted for, but co-sponsored that legislation. It passed the Senate with a vote of 97-3. In 1990, National Review founder William F. Buckley, for whom this program is named, debated during a fire line debate Charles Rangel, Black congressman from Harlem, about legalizing drugs. Guess who took the position that drugs should be legalized? It was not Charles Rangel. It was William F. Buckley. In fact, Charles Rangel at one point actually proposed the death penalty for crack dealers. And so, as to why the narrative sort of gets spun the way that it does, I think that the purveyors of that narrative are really good at social media, and opponents of it aren't. I also think there's an age gap. Too, I think that the views that you described, sort of friendliness to kind of tougher on crime measures, are much more popular amongst older Black and Latino residents, and I think you see a break generationally speaking. So I don't think that's probably going to be true in 15 years, unfortunately. So that's another part of it. But also we have the advent of social media and cell phone cameras. I mean, we live in a really big country of 330 million people. In a country this big, it's really easy to produce one outrageous video of terrible police conduct for every single day of the year, which can go viral and create the impression that this is a common occurrence, right? What you don't see when it goes right, that's not newsworthy. You don't see all the things that get prevented by virtue of good policing, that's not newsworthy. And so, I just think it's a combination of circumstances, really. A lot of those circumstances are beyond our control, but I think the best that we can do is what we're here doing now, is have these conversations as openly and honestly as we can and push back on the narratives that we disagree with and hope that the truth wins out.
I wonder if you could briefly describe the successes of broken windows policing, and also, is it gone at this point? Or does it exist in some sort of modified form? Or
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's gone at this point. And I think broken windows policing is another one of those kind of amorphous terms. Lots of people use it. Lots of people have different definitions of what they think it means. I mean, the best way to understand broken windows policing is to sort of take a step back and understand that broken windows is a theory. It's not a theory of policing, it's really a psychological theory, right? And the theory posits that when people are confronted with disorder in public spaces, the way that they will process that is to basically say, like, okay, well, this is happening in this space. If that's happening, this person who's urinating on the sidewalk clearly has no fear of doing that, which means that no one's in charge. And if no one's in charge, then anything goes. And if anything goes, and anything can happen to me, which means I'm vulnerable, and pro-social people over time will start to step away from those public spaces. Now, the way that that sort of got brought into policing was that people recognized, well, hey, there is research on safety in numbers. There is research on pedestrian foot traffic and its effect on crime. And so maybe it's the case that if we allow disorder to fester in public spaces and people pull back from those public spaces will become increasingly more vulnerable to crime. And that's exactly how it played out. And so what the New York City Police Department did, kind of leading the country on this front, was start to really pay attention to disorder and lower level offenses, things like public urination, public dice games, public intoxication, fare evasion. And by enforcing those things, they discovered a couple of things that I don't think they quite expected to find. One was that you can actually get a lot of public safety value for your enforcement buck, even when you focus on really lower levels of offending. And lots of people in the police reform debate like to sort of paint this picture in which police are kind of engaged in low-level activity like traffic stops, and that this is a waste of their time, and that's why the clearance rate for homicides is so low. And if we just diverted them away from this and to robberies and homicides, that we would have all of these big public safety benefits. And I think that's wrong, in part because it misunderstands why the clearance rate for those kinds of offenses is so low, but it also elides the fact that there's a lot of overlap between who commits lower-level offenses and who commits really serious crime. I mean, even the most violent offenders among us do not commit violent crimes on a daily basis, but they do generally have antisocial dispositions that will manifest themselves in a number of ways. So as I mentioned earlier, 42% of gun recoveries in New York City begin as a traffic stop. Why is that? Well, people who carry guns illegally usually don't have any qualms about speeding or changing lanes without signaling or using fake license plates, right? I mean, very rarely will you ever meet an offender who says, no, I just kill people. I don't litter, I don't rob, I don't steal, I don't shoplift, right? I'm just a murderer. I'm just, I just hit people when I get angry. Like, that's not how it works. Generally speaking, there's a lot of that overlap. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it was so successful, because you could actually find contraband and discover more serious criminal conduct by enforcing some of these lower level offenses. So when Commissioner Bratton first came to New York, he actually did not start at the NYPD, he started in the transit police. And he really stepped up fare evasion, and what he found was that 1 in 6 fare evaders had an open warrant at the time of their arrest. So here's a really easy way to engage with people who are clearly breaking the law, and you're getting a massive number of warrants settled. And these are people who have, much more serious criminal histories. 1 in 20 was found to be carrying an illegal weapon. It's a really effective way to take guns off the street. I mean, for people who sort of propose rolling back these kind of proactive lower level enforcement measures, what I often find helpful to ask them is, well, how else then would police be expected to, say, recover illegally possessed guns? Should they rely on heuristics to try and identify who's illegally packing? Or would you be more comfortable with them enforcing objectively passed rules and then coming across these guns, which is actually more effective because it's really hard, to figure out like, oh yeah, this guy is up to no good. I mean, sometimes there's evidence of that, right? That's why we have Terry stops. But other times it's more difficult. So, obviously that kind of enforcement program is disfavored now in a lot of parts of the country. And so you've seen a real pullback of police proactivity on all sorts of fronts. You're seeing declines in traffic enforcement. You're seeing some policies that actually prevent it, right? So, out in Los Angeles, police officers can't conduct pretextual traffic stops anymore, where you have an objective traffic violation, right? But let's say you think that the car belongs to a local gangbanger, and so like maybe they've got a gun, and so you wouldn't normally stop a car for, having a license plate light out or something like that, but you're going to do it with this one because, hey, maybe you recover something. And this is really effective policing tactic, but it's now been restricted. You're now seeing, local DAs saying they're not going to prosecute any arrests for fare evasion or public urination or public intoxication. So that, we're kind of losing out on a lot of those potential benefits. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's dead yet, but I do think that we have forgotten as a society a really important history lesson, and we're sort of, reaping the seeds that we've sown on that front. But I do think that there is still, a very strong case to be made for that kind of enforcement, especially now because we can do it better. We have data. We know where the pockets of crime are. We know who are, we can do social network analyses and figure out who the 1,000 or so people responsible for the majority of shootings in a given jurisdiction are. Like, we can be much more precise and much less dragnet than we were in the 1980s and 90s, and that should really, I think, make that kind of approach much more attractive to opponents than it currently is. It just takes someone making that case effectively and persistently.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to shift really quickly to like the international front. Wanted to ask about in your discourse, in your studies, basically, have you dealt with international data, different countries about things like discharge or anything of that sort? Whether that data is kind of like credible or comprehensive enough in your analysis, and in your debates or discourse, have opponents use that data, in counter arguments, and how do you kind of square that with your own?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any reason to be skeptical of the validity of data from other countries, especially other like developed democracies that have good data infrastructures along the lines of what we have here. In fact, our data infrastructure is not that great, if I'm being frank with you. So, one of the things that debate opponents will point to, for example, is the lower rate of police use of force in other countries, other Western European democracies, the lower rate of incarceration in other parts of the world, and this is sort of to be taken as prima facie evidence of America's sort of punitive disposition that's sort of unique. And I think the best answer to that kind of critique is just to point to something that often is willingly recognized and readily recognized in the context of different debates, like debates about gun control, but that is that the United States is just a much more violent society than lots of other places in the world. It's not a particularly nice distinction to have. I wish that weren't true, but it is true. And we are an armed society as well, so we've got much more volatility in police-citizen encounters that might exist in other parts of the world. But one thing I do point them to is the statistic I mentioned earlier, comparing the rate of complaint filed against police here in the United States versus the UK, which is very similar, despite the fact that most cops in the UK don't actually carry a weapon. And engage in serious uses of force at a much lower rate by virtue of that fact. But then again, the populace in the UK is not armed at the rate that it is armed here. The UK doesn't have anywhere near as many pockets of concentrated violence that we have here. I mean, in the book, I do this analysis, and I think in the second chapter, where I kind of respond to this argument in the context of the incarceration debate. And I point to 4 American cities and just a handful of neighborhoods in those 4 American cities, which combined had a population of about 470,000 people. Those neighborhoods had 10% of all of the homicides seen in the entirety of England, Wales, and Germany, despite having about well over 100 million people between them. Just 0.3% of the population resided in these handful of urban enclaves here in the United States. So, it's just not an apples to apples comparison. So there's a limit to what we can take from those kinds of international comparisons.
I'm wondering to what extent you're concerned about police being dishonest and how that may affect statistics. This is anecdotal, but I've heard and read quite a few stories about police interacting with someone and sort of putting them down for resisting arrest and saying they didn't use force, and then there's either eyewitnesses or body cam footage comes out later, and it turns out, like, you know, at least according to the footage, it looks like the police were using force to assault that person. And maybe those statistics never get updated, or in other ones, you know, the footage just never does come out. So I'm sort of, I'm curious how concerned you are about that generally in terms of police reform, and then also if you think that it could make the statistics less reliable.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not particularly concerned about it at a meta level. I mean, I do think it happens, but I don't think it happens enough to affect the general direction of the data. One of the reasons for that is that if, in fact, police were sort of fiddling with the data in some significant way that would register on a sort of national level, you would expect to see a discrepancy between police data on use of force and citizen self-reported data on use of force. So as I mentioned during my talk, the Bureau of Justice Statistics administers a survey to people who have contact with the police and asks them, among other questions, of whether or not they were subjected to the use of force, whether or not they were threatened by force, whether or not they were yelled at, whether they were put in handcuffs, a bunch of questions. And there isn't a disparity between those self-reporting requirements among people who've had contact with the police and what the police departments themselves are saying. So that, I think, is probably the biggest piece of evidence for why, you know, we shouldn't worry too much about it. I mean, again, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen on an individual level in some way that, you know, might affect things at the margins. And we have 18,000 police agencies in this country, you know, nearly 700,000 police officers. You know, most of them are really good, honest people. Doesn't mean that there aren't bad apples, but yeah, I'm just not particularly worried about it.
This will be our last question.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I know earlier you were talking about predictive policing, and I'm curious, in the context of China's authoritarian stance, like them having cameras everywhere to monitor their state, like citizens, as a form of predictive policing, like when is it too much?
Well, that's one example of where it's too much for sure. But no, I mean, I think when people talk about predictive policing, they kind of misunderstand what's really meant by that. I mean, what we're talking about is using broad data sets to draw conclusions about where and when crimes can be expected to happen. And then through actual investigation, you can develop intelligence that tells you a little bit about who it is that's driving those kinds of crimes. And then you can use that data to inform algorithmic risk assessments that will, you know, give you a more accurate sort of reading that helps you inform how you deploy resources. And that's really where it stops, right? You don't arrest somebody in anticipation of them committing a crime, but if you know that there is a corner that has been that has had a few drug arrests recently, and you know through intelligence gathering that this drug crew has a beef with another drug crew, and you know that it's a particular person that's targeted, you may put officers in that area, you know, say on a Friday night when shootings are much more likely to happen than, say, on a Tuesday afternoon, and try and mitigate that problem and head it off. So that's what's really meant by predictive policing. It's not, you know, sort of preemptive enforcement, which I think would be incredibly problematic and I also wouldn't jibe with our Constitution. And so you have those protections built into our system in a way that just doesn't exist in China. And so that, you know, is really gives me a deep sense of relief, and I think should give you all a deep sense of relief as well.
Well, with that, I hope you all join me in thanking Rafael Mangual for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.